Record. Okay, you should have gotten a notification that we're recording, hopefully.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well then, welcome everyone to SFOX's interview with Samson Mow, who is the CSO of Blockstream and formerly the COO of BTCC. Samson, thank you so much for joining us today, man. Really excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
Well, so I figured we could start things off with a general introduction question. You know, personally, one of the things I love so much about chatting with people in the space is that everyone has their own story of how they fell down the crypto rabbit hole in the first place. And you are one of the oldest members of the crypto rabbit hole and Bitcoin rabbit hole at that. So I was hoping you could just share a little bit about how you first got interested in Bitcoin and crypto and what drew you to it.
Sure. I think there's like older OGs, and they asked me like when you got into it, and I say late 2014, early 2015. They say, "Oh, you're so new." So it's a spectrum, right? But yeah, I got interested, I think in 2012 or so, 2013, when I was reading about Bitcoin. So I'm from the game industry originally, and you know we build online games with economies that have to be managed and such. And it was really interesting reading about Bitcoin because it's something that kind of exists on its own, but it still can be used as currency and be traded.
We should definitely circle back to gaming later on in our conversation because I'm a huge gamer and I know you have a lot of experience in the industry, and that just seems like such a hotbed of opportunity for crypto. But you know, one of the questions I wanted to ask you again about your early experience in the industry is you served as the Chief Operations Officer of BTCC, right, which was one of the first, if not the first, exchange in Asia for cryptocurrencies, right? So given that experience, right, from the exchange side, how do you see crypto as having evolved over the years, and what was it like just to be there at the beginning of BTCC and watch it grow?
So I think BTCC it's one of the oldest. It was one of the oldest. The older one could be the Rock Trading. It's a European exchange, but it's like by 1 month who's older, and we never did settle that. But BTCC got to be the biggest exchange, I think, worldwide after GOX imploded. So everyone started going to BTCC to start trading. So for a time, you know, it was number one and top of the world and everything like that. But I guess looking back, you kind of realize that it's a experience that you have to take with a grain of salt. You know, if you're number one today, it doesn't mean you're number one tomorrow.
I'm so sorry you cut out for a second on like the second part of your answer. You said looking back, you have to realize, and then I missed what you said after that.
I was just saying, like, if you're number one today, you're not necessarily number one tomorrow. So it's good to be a bit more humble in how you operate.
Sure, that's a good point. I feel like that's a lesson and a message worth repeating in the crypto sector, especially, right? Because even the oldest companies in the space haven't been around for that long. And so there's been a lot of turnover and turning of the wheel of fortune, so to speak, right?
Yeah, but the time when you are big and you know, number one, that's the interesting time, right? So back then, I think when Vitalik was trying to launch Ethereum, they came to visit us and pitch us on Ethereum and get listed. So back then, BTCC only listed Bitcoin and Litecoin with a Chinese yuan pair, and they were trying to get listed. And I read a bit about it before the meeting, and I thought it wasn't really a good idea. So I actually walked out of the meeting halfway through when they were pitching.
Oh my gosh, wow. I never would have expected that. Oh, they must not have loved that reception. I can imagine.
Probably not.
That's a good transition, actually, because one of the things I was hoping to chat with you about with regard to your exchange experience is exactly this idea of listing and delisting assets, right? Last month, one of the big stories was Binance delisting Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, right, BSV. And so from your perspective, especially given your exchange experience, do you have any views on maybe what the responsibilities of exchanges are in terms of how they list and delist assets? Because BSV's price tanked over that news, right, of Binance delisting it. So do you think that there are any sort of standards of responsible conduct when it comes to an exchange deciding to list or delist an asset? How should they go about that?
Well, I think every exchange has their own criteria, but it's not a regulated space, so it's hard to say if everyone is following their own criteria. But with the number of exchanges, it's kind of hard to have any solid standard. So some exchanges may delist something, some may not delist something because it doesn't hit some requirement or hit some level of trading volume needed. But overall, I would say exchanges should be careful about what they do list, because a lot of these projects are pretty scammy and backed by pretty questionable people, as we've seen. So it would have been better to not list them in the first place than to need to delist them. I guess that's my position. And it does have a big impact. So listing, both delisting and listing, has a big impact on any project, right? So the process can be improved overall, I think, but there's also a big learning curve to understand how things work. So I think Bcash was probably the first one, right? They kind of snuck themselves in saying, we're splitting and causing a lot of confusion about what's going to happen. So exchanges kind of listed them by default because they weren't sure what was going to happen. And I guess BSV kind of had the same thing happen because they're also very loud and noisy, a lot of confusion. And because it's a Bitcoin fork, like people kind of thought maybe we have to list them, right? But that's not really a way that is sustainable for any exchange to operate, because you could fork Bitcoin, I could fork Bitcoin, and are you going to support every single one? And is the code secure? Is the chain secure? It probably isn't resistant to 51% attacks. And there's a huge ton of customer support overhead to deal with too when things like these happen. So I guess it's overall a big learning curve. People have to have learned that Bitcoin is Bitcoin. Someone can fork it and make a copy, but you should probably have a policy against forks. Otherwise, you'll never be able to keep up.
So it sounds like you're saying that the answer to the delisting problem is that exchanges need to just be more selective in some regards in terms of what they list in the first place. Is that right?
Yes, I think so.
Got it. We talked with Jimmy Nguyen from the BSV community about this a couple of weeks back, and one of the things that he was talking about that I thought was interesting is sort of the difference between quantitative and qualitative criteria for when an exchange decides to list or delist something, right? So one of the things that Binance talked about when they published their delisting criteria kind of after the fact with BSV was the degree to which a project might be helpful or harmful to the overall crypto ecosystem, right? So do you have any views on whether qualitative criteria like that might be harder to measure have a place in whether an exchange decides to list or delist certain assets?
It's been a long time since I've run an exchange, so I haven't thought that much about the policies. But the quantitative one is tricky because, as you know, numbers can be manipulated. If you say you have to have X volume, well, someone will go and make the volume because it'll cost them, a couple K a month to pay a market maker, and they're going to make a lot more on the backside of having that listed and trading it. But it's probably a mix of the two. I would look probably at market depth and some qualitative measurements too.
Sure, that makes sense. One question that actually comes from the broader SFOX community that I thought was really interesting is about the notion of centralized exchanges and whether or not that's kind of contradictory in the crypto ecosystem, right? Because you think about a project like Bitcoin that, at least in the first instance, right, is all about decentralization, no third-party control over the network, things like that, right? And then you have these very centralized exchanges that sort of seem to be the arbiters of people buying and selling those decentralized assets, right? So do you think there's some kind of paradox or problem that needs to be solved there, or is that not really an issue in your eyes?
It's a tricky one because you need centralized exchanges for, one, high volume trading. On real decentralized exchanges, it's very low velocity. So there's BISC. They've been around for a long time. I would say they're a real decentralized exchange. You download the client, you run it yourself. But the problem has always been velocity, right? You don't have large orders, a large amount of people trading, and you can't execute quickly. So there is a need for a centralized exchange to allow that rapid trading. But I think moving forward, we'll have a bit more trustless trade, trustless exchange, because we can do things like atomic swaps. So large blocks of trading can happen like between individuals through single chain atomic swap transactions or something like that. But yeah, I think there are different segments that different things fill, and centralized exchanges do fill an important segment for trading lots of things, leverage trading and whatnot.
Sure. So especially if you're a high volume trader or an institutional client or something like that, right? It seems like centralized exchanges will remain the way to go. That makes sense. As you said a couple minutes ago, right, you haven't been running an exchange for a while. Now you're at Blockstream, which has its hand in so many things in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So just to ease the conversation into that, I was wondering if you could talk about why you decided to leave BTCC for Blockstream.
Well, part of it may be, creative differences with Bobby, like how the direction of the company should move in. And part of it is just the stuff that Blockstream is working on, I find very interesting. So BTCC was actually one of the first people that signed up for Liquid. And I think that was me, basically, because I thought it's really interesting tech. It has large implications for the industry as a whole, and it can address a lot of issues like liquidity and moving into things like trustless trade down the road. So single chain atomic swaps, those are things that you can do in the Liquid blockchain. But yeah, I decided to jump onto Blockstream. Also, because I wanted to launch Liquid. So I signed up, I think, in 2015, and things were moving a bit slower. So I thought, okay, maybe I should join and help them launch this baby.
And that seems to be the story for so many people in the crypto ecosystem that I've talked to. Like, they'll see a project that they love, it's not moving fast enough, so they'll find a way to dedicate all their time to it. Seems to be a common story.
Yeah.
I love that. Since you mentioned Liquid, maybe I'll just give you the opportunity to expand on that. What do you see as its most exciting use cases? Why did you love it so much that you felt like you needed to jump into Blockstream to make it move faster?
So the elevator pitch is Liquid is an inter-exchange settlement network. It's a side chain, so it's pegged to the Bitcoin blockchain. So essentially, you lock up Bitcoin on the main chain and unlock it in Liquid, and it gives it unique properties. So you can move it faster, and you can do interesting stuff too in Liquid, like issue assets, like tokens, security tokens, stable coins, anything like that. And there's actually more stuff about Liquid that we haven't talked about too much, but assets within Liquid can also have their own Lightning network. So if you issued an SFOX token in Liquid, you can eventually power that through SFOX token Lightning network. But yeah, the main thing about the network is letting people move Bitcoin quickly. That's like the primary focus. So there are large spreads on different exchanges, and we think having Liquid and being able to connect to different exchanges and move Bitcoin rapidly should help with that. Also, if there's congestion on the Bitcoin network, like we saw in 2017, I think some of it is manufactured, but some of it is real too, right? A lot of people are transacting, they're transacting inefficiently, but Liquid is a single purpose chain. It's just for financial transactions. There are companies out there that spam the Bitcoin blockchain, like Veriblock, right? So they're just dumping transactions into Bitcoin, and they're making up like 20-30% of all transactions just to anchor their data to Bitcoin. And I don't think someone would do that in Liquid. It wouldn't make as much sense. But it's a single purpose chain, so you won't be congested. And if you do tokenize something in Liquid, you won't run into the same problems as something like, say, Ethereum, where if one project is successful at CryptoKitties, then everything else grinds to a halt because all the blocks are full.
And you avoid that problem that Ethereum has because it's a single purpose chain as opposed to Ethereum, which is multi-purpose. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so we're just about financial transactions, settlement of anything like from Bitcoin to tokens or whatnot, and there's no computing on the blockchain, which Ethereum is trying to do, and that's their biggest problem.
Got it. That makes sense. I imagine from kind of a marketing perspective, though, because that's how I think about a lot of these things, you might encounter kind of a similar problem to Ethereum, or tell me if you think you do, because it seems like one of the exciting but maybe challenging things about Liquid is, even though you have this main vision for it with an inter-exchange network, as you said, it can also be used for all of these other things, like potentially issuing your own token and having your own Lightning network and things like that. So do you feel like it's hard with those broader projects with a lot of capabilities to explain it in, as you said, an elevator pitch to the people who you want to be developing it and working on it?
Mm-hmm. So your question is like, do you mean we'll have the same problem later if people are doing a lot of things on Liquid with congestion?
Yeah, well, not a problem in terms of the computing power and the blocks getting full, because I take that point. But I feel like in my own experience with a project like Ethereum, right, it's difficult to even explain what the project is to people, because there are so many different use cases for it, and people are trying to do so many different things with it. And I can envision Liquid encountering that problem, right? A problem of just explaining succinctly what it is when there are so many different potential use cases for it, right? Have you encountered?
Yes. Yeah, so for exchanges, we just tell them it's inter-exchange settlement with asset issuance. And it is high performance and doesn't require a lot of resources. So you can run a Liquid node on an old laptop, actually. It's actually very lightweight. So if you're an exchange, and I have a lot of friends still in the exchange space. So for, say, let's keep picking on Ethereum. A lot of them are having trouble keeping up running an Ethereum full node. And the Ethereum guys keep changing the definition of what is a full node. But from an exchange perspective, it means that you can validate everything. And that is hard to keep in sync. So they keep adding more RAM, trying to optimize and do a lot of things, but it is getting more and more difficult. Eventually, you have to offload it to someone else and keep it in a data center. But for Liquid, it's really lightweight. You can run it on a laptop. You probably wouldn't. You could run it on a 1U server or something. But just running the Liquid client, you can accept any token issuance in Liquid in this one machine. And it is very lightweight. And because you're not computing, you're not stuffing all this smart contract stuff into the blockchain, then it won't become terabytes of data or become unwieldy.
That's pretty cool. And the notion of connecting all these different exchanges sounds not unfamiliar coming from SFOX, since, as I think that's kind of our whole pitch too. So I like that. Maybe zooming back a bit from Liquid to thinking about Blockstream more generally, right? As I read about Blockstream and came to understand it a bit more, it seems like a lot of your projects and enterprises fit into one of two categories, right? At a high level, those that are potentially revenue generating and those that are more just pro bono or for the sake of the ecosystem, right? With, on the one hand, the potentially revenue generating side, things like Satellite or even Liquid. And then on the other side, things like Bitcoin core development and C Lightning, right? So how do you kind of decide which projects to pursue in each of those categories? And what incentivizes Blockstream to be committing so much energy into the ecosystem that might not be pushing revenue right back towards them, like core development?
Okay, so maybe I'll correct one thing first. So Satellite is not a revenue generating product or project.
Oh, okay.
We can broadcast for fees, but that's negligible compared to the cost. So we do have some ideas that we want to do with Satellite later, but they're still in the works. But Satellite is what we classify as a Halo project. So we classify priorities like A priority, B priority, and Halo. And it's just coincidence. It's the letters for Atom, Back, Hashcash.
Oh, that's cool.
But yeah, Satellite is a Halo project. It's just to, make Bitcoin more interesting for everybody, because people love satellites. They like setting up their receivers, and it also makes Bitcoin better, more resilient too. So there is a practical element to that. Because we're building everything on top of Bitcoin, we also need to make Bitcoin more robust, right? So Liquid is anchored to Bitcoin. So we don't want Bitcoin to have problems. So like say a network split. Blockstream Satellite can avert a network split. So say an undersea cable is cut from, cut to some country like Malaysia, then they could potentially fall out of sync with the rest of the network. But if anybody in that country is running Blockstream Satellite, they'll keep the country in sync with the rest of the Bitcoin, even if their internet is cut off. And I think without this redundancy, it's hard to build the future of financial system, right? If Bitcoin is the future of the financial system, it needs to have these redundancies and fallbacks. But yeah, our main projects are liquid, as you know, and we also have a cryptocurrency data feed. So these are the two things that we want to be building on as a primary focus, and we will monetize them in various ways. So liquid, we're building products on top of liquid that will be monetized. Liquid itself is all open source, and it's a federation of members. So it's not something we monetize directly. We charge fees to support the network, like customer service and customer support. But we have the ICE data feed, which we actually do monetize. So that was developed in partnership with ICE. ICE is the owner of the New York Stock Exchange and Bakkt. So we aggregate data from crypto exchanges. I think we're at 200 million trade in quotes per day in the system. We've got 30 different exchanges in the feed and 60 crypto assets. So that is sold through ICE's network, and we have a rev share on that. But everything else we build is kind of, it makes Bitcoin better, and we also have a use for it too. So for example, we acquired Green Address that was founded by Lawrence Nahum. So that's a popular Bitcoin wallet, multi-sig, highly secure. We're also working to integrate it with the rest of the things we need to integrate with. So say supporting liquid or other things down the road. So and everything fits together for what we were trying to build.
Got it. That makes sense. So building out the Bitcoin infrastructure and then finding ways to monetize all the different projects on top of it down the road. It sounds like that's the strategy. Is that right?
Yeah.
It's a cool enterprise block stream because there seem to be so many big players in Bitcoin who are involved in it or have been involved in it over its existence so far, right? And it seems like the one big departure that you guys have had so far was Greg Maxwell, right? So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to why he decided to leave and work independently of the company as opposed to staying with Blockstream.
Yeah, so Greg was always half-time. His time was split between working on Bitcoin, open source project, and on Blockstream as CTO. So he was helping build up the company, and I think he found it was time to focus solely on Bitcoin. That's his passion, right? And the interesting thing about open source development is that we can still work together with him on a lot of stuff that we need to work together on, whether it is liquid or satellite. That's all. These are all open source projects. So despite him not being CTO by title, we still actually have a lot of talking, a lot of communication with him and talk to him about different things, and he still helps out on a lot of different things too. So I think if it's a traditional company building something closed sourced, it's a bit different. But for us, it's everything we're building is basically open source. So it's still very collaborative.
That is pretty cool. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I guess the open nature of so many projects in crypto allow relationships and collaborations to continue even if people decide to have different associations between the various companies in the space. That's neat. Yeah.
But Blockstream Satellite is his baby, so it was something he thought up originally. So of course he's still very invested in advising and keeping it on track. Sure,
that makes sense. To pivot a little bit and maybe talk about spies and espionage, right?
Sure.
There's this interesting notion, maybe a joke notion to some, a serious notion to others, of the Blockstream spy, right? For instance, to pick one example, Jian Wu saying that maybe Craig Wright is a Blockstream spy, things like this. So I was wondering if you could maybe just speak to what your views on that are, how someone can prove they're not a Blockstream spy, how that contributes to the broader ecosystem of crypto.
So that example you gave is interesting because there were people on the BSV side that were saying Jihan was a Blockstream spy too.
That is funny.
So that's kind of why I decided to make the hat, to poke fun at the silliness, right? So everyone is a Blockstream spy. So to answer your question, you can't tell who is or who isn't a Blockstream spy because someone that is wearing the hat could be a Blockstream spy and is wearing the hat to convince you otherwise, right? Like, why would a spy wear a hat saying it's a spy? See, that's the brilliance of the hat.
Right, I see that. That's good. It's I personally find it maybe a little silly, but I do feel like there's something there that I want to probe you about a little more because, I think it's a little related to what we were just talking about in terms of the openness of the ecosystem, right? Because on the one hand, you do have that open source collaborative nature, right? And then on the other hand, especially in the last few years and with the contentious forks, it seems like in various pockets of the ecosystem, there's a lot of distrust and animosity between different factions, right? And you have a big Twitter presence. You're one of the big people on crypto Twitter, so I know you're familiar with this firsthand, right? So maybe on a more serious note, you could speak to how you view that other side of the crypto ecosystem and community, and if you have any recommendations to ordinary people in the cryptoverse on how to communicate with each other in a productive way and move the ecosystem forward.
Yeah, that's a very salient point. I mean, there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there. I mean, I think I've seen them all pretty much. There are theories that say Bilderberg controls Blockstream because I think someone from the Bilderberg group was the chairman of AXA, and AXA's venture arm invested in Blockstream. Therefore, we're trying to destroy Bitcoin because the Bilderberg group doesn't like Bitcoin. But I guess the easiest way to cut through is to understand open source development. That is the root of all of the problems and misunderstandings and conspiracy theories, I think. Because people like to say, these guys at Blockstream, like when Blockstream was founded, a lot of the founders were contributors to Bitcoin, right? And they said, okay, all these guys got together, made a company, now Blockstream controls Bitcoin. But that's really not how it works. Open source development doesn't work that way. You still have to develop in public, discuss things in public, and get acts on ideas. And there's a committee to go through everything, and then things that are built and done, they go through a maintainer, which will merge them, and the maintainer cannot maliciously merge it. Bitcoin is not the repo. There's a lot of things like that. It all comes down to this misunderstanding, right? Like, if you were a developer and you worked on Bitcoin and you fixed a bug today, does that mean you're always a Bitcoin developer if you didn't work on it for 5 years, right? But people kind of think like, oh, those guys are Bitcoin developers, but they're really just developers, and they might contribute, they might stop contributing. Like, I think one example is Peter Todd. He says former Bitcoin contributor. I don't think he does anything anymore, right? But he's still associated with the project, and he has weight in the things that he says because he's a smart guy and he's influential, but he doesn't control anything. So I think the biggest misunderstanding still stems from all of that. So for the regular people, just look up open source development and try to get a grasp on how it works. And I think that will help frame a lot of the understanding and clear up a lot of the FUD.
Maybe just to push on that a little further, in addition to these forks and various factions forming over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion about the original intent behind Bitcoin, right? Kind of culminating in the naming of BSV, right? Literally calling it Satoshi's vision, right? And it strikes me that you might have an interesting perspective on that, since you're so embedded in kind of the as you say, the open source and ongoing development of Bitcoin. So from your perspective, what, if anything, do you think is the role of that original intention with which Bitcoin was created? Is that something to which developers feel beholden now or should look to as they continue to develop Bitcoin? Or do you think that's just an artifact of the past or something else entirely?
So it's interesting you brought that up. I actually wrote an article for CoinDesk, I think for the January 3rd Bitcoin 10th birthday, but it was about why the white paper is not the Bible. So if you go and check out the article, it's on samsonmow.com. That's my personal blog. I kind of outlined how it came to be. So Satoshi wrote the code first, then he wrote the white paper. So the white paper is more of a summary of the code than anything. He wrote the code before cache, whatever. But the code is really what matters. It's not about the white paper. The white paper is describing simply what the code does. And that description will change as the code evolves over time. Like, there are a lot of things that are not in the white paper, like mining. Mining is something that happened after. Does that mean we should get rid of mining? Is mining a bad thing? Not really, right? Or sorry, mining pools to be correct. But there's a lot of things that have changed since the white paper. Like, it's just a document that was written 10 years ago, and Bitcoin evolves. It's software, right? Software has to evolve. And if you are a developer or are aware of how development works, you understand that things keep changing. There are bugs. There are dependencies on other things like libraries that may have security holes in them that need to be patched later on. But it has to keep evolving over time. And I guess the most concrete example is people are worried now about quantum computing, right? Well, eventually something will be done to minimize the threat of quantum computing breaking certain parts of Bitcoin, but that's not going to be in the white paper either, right? Ultimately, Bitcoin is a piece of software that we run because we choose to run it, and you can always opt out, and that's what some people do when they go and follow Bcash or BSV and they want to follow some original vision, and that's totally okay if they choose to do that. But the bulk of the people, if you look at the price, Bitcoin is 95% bigger than Bcash. The bulk of the people are following Bitcoin, and they understand what Bitcoin is, and they don't really care what the title of the white paper is, or even who Satoshi is or isn't.
So it sounds like your philosophy in a nutshell would be code first, ideology second. Is that right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Even Satoshi said, I'm not very good with words, I'm better with code. So if you want to follow ideology, then read what Satoshi wrote and follow that.
Interesting. It does seem to me, even given that people have such different ideologies, right? Especially in this day and age of crypto, where it continues to just be blossoming with so many different altcoins, you can kind of design code and have whatever community you want around sort of any code base or set of principles that appeal to you, right? That actually leads me into another question I was interested in picking your brain about, because, as you say, people can opt out of something like Bitcoin, but it also still controls so much of the overall market cap of crypto, and Blockstream is pretty squarely focused on Bitcoin as opposed to crypto more broadly, right? So given that, what do you see as the relationship between Bitcoin and all of the other altcoins out there, right? Both in terms of what the relationship is now and what you think the relationship ought to be going forward.
Well, I think Bitcoin is in a class of its own, right? Every altcoin is created by a person or a company that is backing it, actively marketing it, and actively controlling development. But for Bitcoin, Satoshi put it out there and then disappeared, and has still disappeared. And the developers are all working on it and making it better. So it's kind of taken on a life of its own. Someone coined the phrase like Bitcoin had a virgin birth, right? None of the altcoins have that. They're just, they're all copies of Bitcoin's concept. Then it can't really compete because someone is able to assert authority over it and control the roadmap or have influence over that. So I think Bitcoin is in its own class, and then there's everything else. And in the everything else, there's also different classes too, right? There's really scammy stuff, and there are real legitimate projects.
Sure. Do you have any advice to people out there who are reading this or listening this in terms of how to discern the scammy projects from the legitimate projects?
That's really tricky. Being in the space for a long time, you understand, but for someone new, it's very hard because a lot of the scammier projects look very shiny and pretty. That's why they're scammy, right? Like like people say Bitcoiners are really mean and toxic and whatnot, right? Because they tell you the truth that you don't want to hear. Whereas the con men are very nice and they say very nice things and they make you feel really good, and it's a different experience. So I guess the simplest way to tell people would be to say, if someone's trying to sell you on a project or sell a coin to you, it's probably not a good coin. If there is not much marketing and, like Bitcoin, there's no marketing behind it. It's just people decide to have it, own it, use it, then it's probably a legitimate project. But if there's a marketing team, you're seeing ads on Facebook or on Twitter, then, maybe you should think twice.
Good advice. Good advice. Maybe we could talk more for a second just about crypto in practice. How do you use Bitcoin in your everyday life?
I don't. I use credit cards.
Okay. So you don't really have an everyday use case for it at all yet. Is that right?
No.
I guess that's why you're investing so much in the infrastructure still. Is that what you say?
Oh, well, Bitcoin does have use. It's more of a store of value and a medium of wealth transfer. It's not something you would use every day in payments, right? Like I've said this before, and people have twisted around and said I hate Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is bad for payments. You don't design a payment system that takes 10 minutes to settle on average. It's not 10 minutes. It's on average 10 minutes. So it could take 3 hours sometimes if you're a trader. And this is why people want to use Liquid, because you have 2-minute full settlement. So 1 minute block times is about 2 minutes for full settlement. So if I'm wiring money to an exchange, I know, okay, I'm going to have my confirmation in a minute and it's settled in 2. That's way better if you're trying to arb or trade than sending it and waiting for 6 confirmations, which could be an hour or maybe more. But yeah, going back to the point, it's not good for everyday use because you shouldn't be making payments with it. You should be making payments over the Lightning Network because that is instantaneous and almost free. That's what it was designed for. So everything is designed for a different purpose. Bitcoin was designed for settlement and wealth transfer. Lightning. Oh, Charlie's gonna like that one. Lightning was designed for fast payments and cheap payments.
And in fact, one of the things that you said before is that Bitcoin is really just at bottom information, right? It's information that a lot of people see as money. Looking further out, now that you've already said it, that Bitcoin itself is not ideal for payments, right? How do you see the ways in which the world will ultimately use and see this information that is Bitcoin?
Well, we generally use things however we want, right? So we use a metal, which is gold, for storing wealth and value transfer, right? We use paper for money too. Like, why do we use paper? It's not really good. You can burn it, shred it, but in general, we just use things however we want to use them. Just because Bitcoin is information, it doesn't really change that. So we ended up using information as money too, which is kind of what we do, right? But it is different because it changes the dynamic of how people have control over their money. So with gold and with fiat, it's not really under your own control now. I think before digital money, like dollars in your bank account that you see online, people did have their own cash, right? They would stuff it in a mattress or a bank vault or whatever, but that's not really good. Gold is also not really good because you have demurrage. You have to pay people to secure it. You have to make sure it's not fake, and how do you do that? You have to melt it and reforge it. But Bitcoin is superior in all these aspects. So that it makes sense why we decided to treat this certain information as if it was money, because it's really better in every single way. Like, you can use it for payments too, like with Lightning, and that changes the whole dynamic too. Like, the bulk of our transactions today are on credit, and it is costly because the credit card processors do take 3 to 4%. I think they're trying to go up to 5 now. So that is getting expensive. But now if you're transacting Bitcoin over Lightning, you're not doing it on credit, and the fees are almost 0. So it does change the whole equation a lot.
So in terms of upcoming protocol changes in Bitcoin, Samson, I know you're excited about Schnorr and about L2. Are there any other ones that really have you excited going forward about changing Bitcoin or impacting the future of crypto?
Yeah, so I like privacy. I like CT, confidential transactions. We have those in Liquid, but I think it would be beneficial for Bitcoin to have confidentiality at the base layer. I think that's what Bitcoin is missing to become the best money. And it's not that we can't have privacy and confidentiality today. You can do it, but it's not widely distributed. So you have to, first of all, know that every transaction is visible on the Bitcoin blockchain, susceptible to analysis. And then you have to know that you can have better privacy if you take certain measures. And then you have also to know that I can use a mixer or some software to do CT, then it's more evenly distributed, more fair. And sorry, I just got a message saying my internet's unstable.
Oh, sorry, you cut out in the middle of that answer again.
Yeah, I stopped talking when I saw the internet message.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But so the point is, like,
right now for privacy, you need to rely on things like mixers for Bitcoin, and then you cut out after that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was saying it's not widely distributed. It's some people will know how to have a better level of privacy and others won't. So it is better overall if it is a default. At least that's my opinion. Some people, it's a pretty hot topic. Should we have privacy at Bitcoin's base layer? Some people see it the other way, like it's going to be contentious. We shouldn't do it. Lightning will be good enough, but I think it's important for the base layer as well.
Sure. And just to ask a little further, why do you think it is something that's so important for the base layer as opposed to just on like a payment layer on top of it, like Lightning or something like that? Why is that insufficient?
Well, I think it's just so it's more fair. So everyone has equal access to it. Right now, if you know more, then you have a better level of privacy. And I think it's more equalizing if it was by default so that everyone that's using Bitcoin has that same level of privacy.
I see. I guess that does make sense, especially when there are already so many barriers to entry in terms of understanding Bitcoin and how to use it. To be able to make something like that default, I could see how that would be more fair. Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of the various projects that are out there, right, and potentially interacting with Bitcoin in the future, right, things like stable coins or Lightning Network or even Facebook Coin, right? Do you see them as all in a competitive marketplace with one another, or do you think they'll ultimately complement one another? What does the future look like for those?
So Facecoin, I don't think competes with anything in the crypto space. It might be a crypto token, but as it's coming from Facebook, there's no way that they'll be able to have anybody transact it. They're going to have to control who can send to who and in various amounts too, because it's a company. They have to follow the same rules for money transfers, say PayPal or any of those competing in the payments and money transfer space. So that's the problem with a lot of these projects. People think they compete with Bitcoin, but they actually compete with other centralized payment systems that already are in existence. And it's good for them because they get some buzz. It's like adding blockchain to your company name on the stock market. It's good for you, but it doesn't really change anything. So I think Bitcoin and Lightning is kind of its own class, and then all these other projects like Facecoin are just different dresses on the same pig.
Got it. So I guess your answer to that maybe answers a follow-up question I had, which is one of the things you've said about Lightning Network in particular in terms of what it needs in order to get to where it wants to go is better mobile wallets for receiving offline payments, right? And so one of our team members was wondering whether Facebook could potentially help with that shortcoming of Lightning. But if it's a different dress on the same pig, it sounds like you would say maybe Facebook is not the way to help Lightning Network out there. Is that right?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like they're going in a direction that will help Bitcoin payments. I think what Square is doing is helping a lot more. So they're selling Bitcoin in the Cash App and allowing people to transact there. And they have also invested in Lightning Labs, and I know that Jack has spoken highly of Bitcoin. So I would bet money that Square will do something to advance the usability of Lightning much faster than anything Facebook does. I think they also started that program where they're going to have developers, Bitcoin developers. I think they said crypto developers, but developers for Bitcoin, and they have one position for user experience designer, which is interesting too, because that's something that a lot of people that are working in Bitcoin don't really think about. It's very engineering heavy. That's also part of the Blockstream culture, but the usability and user interface part is a massive area that needs a lot of attention. But yeah, I think Square is going to do more than Bitcoin. Facebook is going to do for Bitcoin.
One of the other things you're involved in that's maybe tangentially related to user experience, or at least popular culture experience of Bitcoin, is magical crypto friends, right? So I was wondering if you could maybe just shed some light for us on how that got started, what the inspiration behind it, what the goal of it is.
So I think it was started by a tweet. I forgot who tweeted. I don't think it was the four of us, but we were talking, Charlie, Whale Panda, Ricardo, and I were talking in some thread. And I think someone commented on the thread saying, you guys should do a show. So after that, we made a group on Twitter and talked and said, should we do it? And we decided yes. So it's kind of like everything we do since then, everything is on a whim. So we said, okay, let's do a show. And then we did a show. We didn't know if we would keep on doing it, but it's like a year plus later and we're still doing it. So obviously we did. We're doing the Magical Crypto Conference this year in New York on May 11th and 12th. That's also on a whim. I think we were at Consensus last year and we said, we can do a better conference. Let's do one next year. And then we did it. So, I think the four of us are kind of, we like to have fun and not take ourselves too seriously. That's kind of the underlying tone of Magical Crypto, and that kind of applies to everything we do.
That's a pretty big difference from a lot of people in the crypto space, especially on Twitter, who seem to take themselves so seriously.
Yes, I think so. But it doesn't help, I think, in the long run, because everything is changing and everyone is learning as they go.
Maybe to close by looking ahead, Samson, what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities and challenges for the space right now and moving forward?
So from talking to a lot of people, there is a lot of interest on tokenized securities, or security tokens. And that's something we're interested too, because that's also something that can be done on Liquid. And it does make sense because, as I talked about before, you can have these single chain atomic swaps. So say you have a stable coin and all these tokenized securities and LBTC, which is liquid Bitcoin, then you can start trading in large blocks in a more decentralized way. So if you want to trade 1,000 shares of SFOX for some Bitcoin, we can do that atomically. So that means the trade executes at exactly the same time. There's no counterparty risk. But there's also interesting things that you can do too, like trust minimized derivatives or peer-to-peer derivatives too, which is kind of along the same line. We did a test recently with our partner, Crypto Garage, where we did a Bitcoin forward, and we lost. We went long, they went short, and we lost $200. But it was all done in a way that we only had to trust outside Oracle that we choose, not each other.
Got it. So as a way of kind of minimizing the need for trust in those transactions and trades.
Yes.
Got it. That I can see why that would be a big opportunity for sure. And then what about on the other side, the challenges? What are the things that the space most needs to overcome right now in order to continue advancing?
Well, I would say understanding what cryptocurrencies are. I think in general, the general population looks at a lot of this stuff and they think they're stocks. They have a ticker, symbol, and a nice logo and a nice sounding name, but they're not stocks. Anybody could make a cryptocurrency or a token. And there's a lot of confusion about, there's a lot of cross confusion. People look at it like it's a stock market too. So they look at the market cap. They don't look at how many units are issued. So, there's like how many billion Ripple out there, right? And people look at the price of an individual Ripple and say it's very cheap, but there's several billion of them, and people don't account for that. But there are some new sites coming up. I think Masari has one. I forgot the name. I think it's On-Chain FX, and I think there's a few other coinmarketbook.cc, but they're trying to show things in a more accurate way that reflects total issuance or factoring market depth or other things like that. But if you're looking at just the price and volume, you're missing the forest for the trees. You're just looking at the wrong thing.
Yeah, one of the themes I definitely hear a lot when I talk to people in the space is that education, we have so far to go in getting people to understand it, which is one of the reasons why I love having these conversations. And I'm sure that people listening and reading this transcript are getting a lot of education just from you. So I appreciate that, definitely.
Yeah, it's good conversation. It is education.
Agreed. Well, Samson, those are all the questions I have. Any other final thoughts from you before we wrap up here?
If you're in New York this weekend, make sure to go to Magical Crypto Conference. Hashtag MCC 2019.
Right on. I love it. What makes it different? What makes it different from some of the other crypto conferences out there while you're pitching it?
There's a lot of fun stuff you'll have to see. We have lots of swag and a lot of fun stuff.
Okay. Swag is enough to get most people there, I have to imagine.
Yes.
Well, Samson, thank you again so much for your time, man. It was so great chatting with you. I personally learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. So, yeah, thank you again for being on with us.
Thanks, Aaron. Great chatting.
Absolutely. All right. So I will, as I